All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to Daf Yomi Week in Review with My Jewish Learning. This morning, we are joined by Rabbanit Dasi Fruchter to steer us around the last 7 dapim this week. All right. Go ahead.
Hi, still just grabbing my notes. Good to see you, everybody. Good morning. What a hard set of dafs this past week. I don't know if folks found it challenging. I certainly did. Really tricky stuff. Just the whole week's tricky, not only conceptually, but also some of it really theologically, historically. There was a lot going on. So let's begin actually with a few 7 million sugyas ago, 7 million topics ago. We were talking about the difference between what it means to be a half slave and a full free person. We're talking about what happens if someone who is half enslaved was going to try to marry a Jewish woman. Does it really work? And so we go back and forth, and this is very Gemara-ish, right? Very Talmudic, that we're trying to figure out that even people can be compartmentalized into different parts, right? So how does it work halachically? Is it after the fact? Does it work or does it not? We talked about that both for women and for men. A major part of the last week, starting in around Daf 43, 44, was about the prohibition of selling one's slave to outside of the land of Israel or to an idolater. And we learned in a Mishnah that if someone sells them to an idolater out of the land of Israel, the slave automatically becomes free. And there was a whole set of agaritas, of stories about this, and also really just a commentary on what the patterns looked like of Jewish slave owners, right? Maybe having relationships with idolaters, selling their slaves, or even lending or borrowing money from non-Jews, and how that would actually work in reality. So I don't know, who did the Daf in review last week? Who did it? Do you know?
I was actually on vacation. I just moved.
Oh,
And one of my colleagues stepped in for me, and I'm not actually 100% sure, but I'm sure some of the folks on this call can tell us in the comments.
I guess I just wondered if you've been grappling at all with slaves, right? The whole question of slaves and enslavement. I'm not even going there, right? Because it's a whole discussion, right? But this is just, we enter into our week of Daf in the middle of that discussion.
We did publish a few pieces dealing with this issue, and I popped them into the chat.
Folks, incredible. Thank you.
Email series.
Thank you so much. All right. What about on Daf 44? We talked about a slave who gave himself over to captors. Like, we talked about that whole question. If that happens and his owner cannot get him either through the courts, Jewish courts or non-Jewish courts, can the owner accept payment from the captors? That was a major question on Daf 44. We also met our friend Reish Lakish, right? Our friend Reish Lakish, who is all over the Gemara as a warring chavruta with Rabbi Yochanan, a warring study partner. We learned about a little bit about his history as a bandit and how he infiltrated a band of cannibals to eliminate them. We talked a little bit about his history, which gives him a lot more color, right? In other sugyot in the Gemara. Okay, so what else? Did I see a hand? Did I see a hand? Did I make it up? No, it was the waiting room. Okay, let's see. So in Daf 45, 46, we saw some review of Nidarim, actually, the laws of vows. And really, we saw a pretty terrible case of a man divorcing his wife without paying the ketubah, claiming that she was what's called an ilonis, which is a woman who does not show any reproductive characteristics. So he says, hey, I didn't mean to marry this person, and then I'm not going to give you your ketubah. Then what happens? She remarries and has a child. And the question is, does she get her ketubah? And this is a very strange situation because now it's been proven that it wasn't actually, quote, a mistaken transaction, which is a really, I'm struggling through this because I found this entire week really, really hard. But there's a lot of statements about the world of what it meant to be a wife and a slave in our week of dafs. For the last 4 days or so, we've entered into the realm of land ownership. We've been talking about if somebody owns the produce of the land, but not the land itself, how does their obligation of bringing the first fruits to the temple work, right? Does that really work? So let's just talk about if, I don't know, I see Judy. Judy's near my screen. Judy Kornitsky, nice to see you. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. But let's say I sell my produce to Judy, right? My apples that grow from my apple tree to Judy, but actually I still own the land that the apple tree is on. Now, who is obligated in bringing those first fruits to the temple? Is it me because I own the land? Or is it Judy because she owns the apples? We went back and forth on this for a long time. What does it mean to own the essence of the land? Is owning the produce like owning the essence of the land? Or is actually owning the land itself what you need to do in order to go back and bring the bikurim, bring the first fruits? Ultimately, we say that Judy brings the first fruits, but without the verses that are said at the temple. Okay. So that was a big discussion. We also talked about the Jubilee year, the Yovel, the Jubilee year, and the question of how land actually reverts back to its original owners. So let's talk about just some clarity for a moment. The Jubilee year, can someone put in the chat, what year is that? What year is the count for the Jubilee year? Put in the chat. Yes, thank you. 50 years, right? So every 50th year. There was something called the Yovel Rishon, the first Jubilee, which was the period of the first temple, where it was not strictly observed. And that was called the first Jubilee. Then you have something called the Yovel Sheni, the second temple Jubilee, where actually the Jews were more careful about the laws of the Yovel. But there's actually a debate about how scrupulously this law was really ever followed. And on our daf of this week, we even learn about the ways in which the laws of the Jubilee are circumvented, right? What does it mean that land will go back to its ancestral owner? What are the limits to that? And that was a big discussion. We talked about how debts that are paid back with land, those lands are not returned during the Jubilee year. We talked about the matter of debts. We also started a new perek, and the chapter, begins with aspects of property law that have nothing to do with divorce. Now, who wants to put in the chat structurally in this Talmudic universe why it is we're talking about random property laws in this tractate right now? On Daf. Yeah, Rob had that. I'm so fast, right? Rob says we're in the middle of talking about tikkun olam, ordinances to protect the benefit of society, right? So we have gone on a majorly winding journey from a man giving his wife a divorce, and we've entered into tikkun olam, rabbinic ordinances that were created to protect society, to protect the benefit of society. Okay. So if you look at the beginning of the 5th chapter of Gittin, which is what we started this week, what's really interesting is that Rashi, our medieval commentator, says, yeah, that's right. There's nothing to do with this and Gittin here. And we are in the realm of tikkun olam. That's what's going on. All right. We also saw a statement in this chapter And I don't know, I'm curious to hear if people will groan or cheer, but probably groan, that women prefer marriage more than men do. That was in this week's Daf, right? We talked about that. Women prefer marriage more than men do. That was one thing that came up here. And the reason, or why it's connected to our tractate halachically, why is this interesting, is because we say that a woman can collect her ketubah payment from inferior lands of the husband's estate, or the ex-husband's or the deceased husband's estate. And we went into a whole rabbit hole around different kinds of lands and how a creditor, right, is able to collect from a debtor from their lands. So let me just go with Rachel. Can I talk to you for a minute about your lands? Yeah. Okay. So if
I'm very recently a landowner.
Oh, where's your new land?
we just bought our first house. So
Mazel tov. Amazing.
Thank you.
Everyone, mazel tov to Rachel. This is amazing. Okay.
Not exactly extensive fields, but we do have a backyard.
Great. So let's say Rachel's got 3 parts of her new backyard. She has a corner with a beautiful fig tree, right? It's producing fig. That would
be nice.
That would be
Maybe
nice.
We should do that.
Yeah. It's sitting in the back there. It's just a small part of the land, but it's clearly the best part of her backyard, right? And then she's got another part of the land which has wildflowers, right? And then a third part of her backyard, which is most of it, which is like kind of sad graying grass. All right. So she's got 3 kinds of land in her backyard: superior land, average land, and inferior land. And what we learn about the laws of debts is that if Rachel owes me money and for some reason she's not able to pay me back, I'm able to go knock on her door and say, I'd like to collect from the wildflower part of your land, the average part of your land. And that's the law. A normal creditor is able to do that. But a woman who's collecting on her ketubah, which lands can she collect from? The inferior lands, right? So that's the least good part of Rachel's backyard. Now, this is interesting because it's not that she's not getting the full value of her ketubah. She's going to get the full value of her ketubah, 200 zuz or whatever it is, but she's just going to get more inferior land, right? As opposed to a small amount of superior land. It will be the same value. Why is this? Why do we say that women have to collect their ketubah from inferior lands? And this is where the question or the statement comes in, because women don't need incentives to get married, but men needed incentives to actually enter into agreements that have ketubahs attached to them, right? So the incentive for the guy or the ketubah bearer, right, the one who's going to write the ketubah for the wife, is that actually if he defaults on the ketubah, or if he, God forbid, dies and his heirs have to pay, it's only going to be from his inferior lands that he has to pay out the ketubah. Does anybody know what other category of person in our daf this week is also only able to collect from the inferior lands of the debtor? The inferior lands of the debtor. This is like the last 3 days. So if you're not caught up, you might not be into it yet. It's orphans. So that if, let's say, I am owed money by Shmerel, and Shmerel passes away, and I'm going to go try to get money from Shmerel's estate and his orphans. Yes, Laura, 10 points to Laura. Round of applause. If that's the case, then I am only allowed to collect from the orphans' inferior land only. And there was a discussion about why. But one reason why was to protect the orphans so that they're not stuck needing to sell off inferior lands. We talked on yesterday's stuff, maybe it was today actually, about whether they are child orphans or adult orphans, which was really interesting. But really, a lot of this daf of this week was discussing these laws of creditors and debtors. We also talked about different kinds of guarantors, right, on a loan. We talked about an orev and a kablan. So let me just say it in English. You've got a guarantor and a super guarantor, right? And I feel like this is worth taking some time to discuss, because there are different kinds of ways to guarantee a loan in halacha. And one of them is actually stronger. And that's called a kablan, someone who takes upon themselves the whole transaction versus someone who comes along and says, I'll co-sign your lease after you ask them, right? It's a different level of responsibility. Let me look at the chat. I forgot to prompt you that, of course, you're welcome to ask questions in the chat this whole time. Throw them in. So Daniel says, if value is the same, what difference does it make from a strictly balancing a book's point of view? You get more. That's right. You get more inferior land. You still have 200 zoos worth of land if you are a widower collecting your ketubah from your deceased husband's estate, but you're stuck with not a fig tree, right? So in this situation, it's just going to be a little bit harder for you to monetize that land. Figure out how to get it to produce or resell it. If it was the superior land, it would be a lot easier, right? But it would still be of the same value. And Merle, if you're able to make inferior land into superior land, then you're just a better farmer than than the person you collected from. And that's great. That's great. And Laura also mentions that it's, the way we define it is a land that's not as productive, right, when it comes to produce. Any other questions at all are welcome to come on in. We also saw something really interesting in this week's daf around the evolution of rabbinic ordinances. We learned about how the basic halacha of, remember I said I could go collect from Rachel the wildflower part of her garden, right, of the backyard, which is the medium kind of land. That's not what the Torah actually says. The Torah actually says, according to yesterday's daf, that I'm really supposed to only be able to collect from her inferior lands in general, like her least good lands. And the rabbis came along and said, I think we need to let creditors collect from slightly better land, the average land. Why did they do that? Why did the rabbis make that ordinance? Because of tikkun ha'olam, because of the benefit of society. What's the benefit of society here? Keep the credit market going, right? So meaning get people to keep loaning money. And actually the words in the Gemara that are used is so that lenders of money don't lock the door before borrowers, right? We actually have a biblical obligation to loan money. And this other obligation was preventing people from loaning money to people who really needed it. So therefore, what the rabbis did is we said, okay, go ahead and collect from average land, the wildflower land. And the question on our daf this week was, wait a minute, if the law is that we can collect from average land, why is it that we're telling the wife and the orphan collectors to only collect from inferior land? And the reason is because that's actually what the Torah says, right? That's actually what the Torah says. So we're really just taking back the original decree in order to make this all work. Other questions? How is designating inferior land for wives and orphans protecting them? Great question. So for women, I don't know that it's really a protection. Ultimately, they're going to get their ketubah. Right? That's the end. That's their protection. Their protection is they're going to get the ketubah. I think designating inferior land for widowers or ex-wives protects the man's investment in the ketubah. Regardless, at the end of the day, she's still going to get the money, but it's not going to be the easiest form of currency. For orphans, if you imagine, let's just use the example that they're children for a second. There was a discussion about whether or not they're children. If they're 10 years old and they have the ability to sell a fig tree, wildflowers, or terrible farmland, right? It's going to be a lot easier for them to list a fig tree on Craigslist than it will be for them to list, any other kinds of land, right? So we say, that a creditor should come and collect from those inferior lands so as to relieve them of that weight, that burden here. Okay. We also talked about the question of what happens if someone damages someone else's land. What kinds of land can the damagee collect from the damager? Do they collect from their inferior, average, or superior lands? And what do we say? It's actually the superior lands, fig tree lands. Why? Because we want to discourage people from damaging other people's property, which was really interesting. Okay, more questions? Any questions? While I keep going. I thought that she was allowed to get her monies from superior land. No, so in our situation, the decree was that she was to collect from inferior land unless there's a stipulation otherwise. Talked a little bit about that as well. Well, today's daf, let's just look at today's daf for a few minutes. Today's daf, we talked about someone returning a lost object and whether or not we ask them to swear about the remainder of the property once they show up. So, let's say that, all right, Claudette. Hi, Claudette. Nice to see you. Let's say Claudette actually comes to me and she says, I found one of your cows. Because I don't know, Claudette, where you are, but perhaps my cows made their way to you. Okay. And I say, no, Claudette, I had 2 cows. Right. And so, and I ask her that she actually has to swear. She has to make an oath to say that there was really only 1 cow. And our Mishnah says, no. We don't make Claudette swear because swearing is not something people wanted to do. Taking these kinds of oaths was a big, big deal, right? And we didn't want people who are returning lost objects to be deterred from doing that. So therefore, we say in our Mishnah that she does not have to take an oath. Now, today's daf was going through a few other cases, trying to figure out if they're really like returning lost objects or not. What about a situation where I owe money to a family, to a man, let's say, and the man dies, and I go to his children, his heirs, and I say, excuse me, I have $100 for you. Is that returning a lost object or is it paying back a debt? Right. So there was that discussion as well. In any event, this was a majorly hard week of dafs. Thank you so much for making your way through it. And the fun thing is that on tomorrow's daf, we get into a interesting and puzzling Mishnah with a lot of beautiful storytelling behind it. So we will get a break from a lot of these technicalities. And I will see you then. I'll see you soon. Thank you, everybody, so much.
Thank you so much, Rabbanit Fruchter. This was not an easy week, and you did it with grace and panache, and we appreciate it. And thank you all for the lovely contributions, for answering the pop quizzes, for asking good questions. Always gratifying to learn with you all. And we will see you in this space next week. And Rabbanit Fruchter, I hope you can see all the gratitude rolling into the comments.
Yes. Thank you, everybody.
Before I close the chat. All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Just appreciate the fact that we have a woman, several women commenting on the daily daf. So it gives me another perspective, which is needed and welcome.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.